I was going to start off with a joke saying you can tell I'm not a medical doctor because I'm not wearing a suit and tie. But Jim spoiled it because today he's wearing his street clothes. And I thought it's the first time I've ever seen him without a suit and tie in 7 years. So my research background is in neovascular AMD, or wet AMD, something I've been working on for about 25 years. And I've been lucky enough to actually be involved in development of treatments for wet AMD. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about advances in dry AMD. If you look at clinical trial websites that different countries have, and you look at the number of trials that were held in 2011 for dry AMD treatments, there were 3 clinical trials. If you would look today, there's something like 30 active trials ongoing. Over the past 3 years, there's been about 50 active trials ongoing. So there's a huge change in the focus of developing investigational treatments for dry AMD. Why is that? What's the point? Well, genetics is leading us down a path where we begin to understand targets, new targets, for treatments for this condition. In addition, we also have ways of being able to identify patients who we think may best benefit from treatments going forward. And so together, that makes it easier to run clinical trials and to try new investigational drugs. And so hence, the hopefulness we have for having new treatments for the disease. So what I'm going to do is update you on some of the therapeutic approaches that we have for treating disease. But before I go there, I need to break dry AMD up into 2 rough categories. One of them is intermediate and early AMD. And then, as Adnan said earlier, then there's the late stage advanced AMD, the dry form, which is called geographic atrophy. This is primarily where medicines are being developed. And the reason that is it's very clear to see benefit in patients in clinical trials, because those patients who have geographic atrophy actually have vision loss, and that can be monitored over time. In the earlier stages of disease, this intermediate and early stage, is much harder to begin to see benefit because there's not as much loss in visual acuity, in vision, central vision. So treatments now are focused on trying to prevent the progression of this damaged retina and retinal pigment epithelium that you heard about over time. So prevent that spread of atrophy around the macula and then benefit vision. In addition, it's also accepted by regulators, both in Europe and in the United States, that when you're watching geographic atrophy, what you're watching is the spread of massive damage to the retina and the underlying tissue. And so they accept the fact that if you can stop that spread, and you can measure that slowing of the spread by using therapeutic treatments, that's an acceptable endpoint. So if you can slow it, they're happy to say that's actually having a benefit for disease and benefit for patients. And so they're making it easier for pharmaceutical companies and academic collaborators and university collaborators to begin to work together to develop these treatments. So I'm going to talk a bit about the treatment strategies, not so much about the particular drugs or approaches that are taken. I may highlight some of these strategies with some examples as we go forward. One of the really interesting and one of the first treatments modalities that was being examined earlier on in the 2000s for trying to stop the spread of geographic atrophy was a very innovative approach. And all these are innovative approaches. This one's clever and challenging for reasons that will become clear. So as Adnan related to you earlier, you're thinking about taking light that comes in, that's transferred into chemical signals through something called the visual cycle. And so cells within the retina and the support cells underneath work together to take light and transform it into chemical signals that then signal to your brain and then produce what you see in terms of images going forward. Now, some very clever scientists recognize the fact that the retina is the most metabolically active tissue in the body, and it produces loads of wastes. And so how about if we just slightly slow down that visual cycle? If you just slightly slow it down a bit, interrupt the cycle slightly, maybe you'll slow down the accumulation of waste. With age, actually accumulate to quite a significant degree. And so therefore you slow the accumulation of waste, slow the damage, and then maybe you'll have a benefit for patients in terms of slowing some of that atrophy and that spread of this geographic atrophy that we talked about. And so those have been under investigation and currently are under investigation now. The interesting thing about that concept is by slowing the visual cycle, you're also slowing the ability to actually adapt to certain conditions like in dim light. And so trying to get that balance correct, slowing the visual cycle but not impairing vision, for example, in a dimly lit room is a challenge for those particular drugs moving forward. But we'll wait and see if they can get the balance right. And we'll know over the next couple of years if that's true. Another approach that was mentioned from Adnan was neuroprotection. And so neuroprotection is just a way of saying we accept there's disease, we don't understand it completely so we can't stop it, but maybe we can protect the cells that we know are eventually dying and leading to visual loss. And so one clever approach that has been taken amongst many that are being taken is to actually take cells that are actually making neuroprotectants. You can actually synthesize them, modify them to make neuroprotectants, and then implant them in a little pellet, and then hope that over a long period of time, without additional injections, they will produce this neuroprotectant over the long term and give a benefit. Now, unfortunately, right now, we haven't seen great results from this kind of therapy, but it's early days, and I think this approach is very clever and innovative going forward. Another approach is just trying to address the fact that there's believed to be inflammatory-driven disease mechanism here. And so there are lots of anti-inflammatories out there that are already approved. And so within an academic setting, as well as in pharmaceutical companies, people are trying to just take well-known anti-inflammatory drugs and apply them and see if they can provide a benefit. For example, rapamycin, which is used to actually reduce the reaction to foreign organs that are transplanted in patients, has been utilized within the setting of looking at dry AMD and advanced dry AMD, injected outside the eye, so you don't have to actually breach the barrier and go in, and then looking to see if there's a long-term benefit to prevent that geographic atrophy spread. And so these investigations are ongoing, and we'll wait and see what the outcomes are going to be. There's a more focused way of trying to address inflammation, and this is based on trying to target the complement system, and you heard about this a little bit earlier briefly. The complement system is very interesting. It's a system that's been devised to actually recognize microbes and then destroy them, literally destroy them. But based on some studies in around 2005, it was found that a number of genetic changes in complement genes, the genes that encode these complement proteins, actually were associated with risks for advancing AMD. And so over the past few years, there had been a development of a number of complement-based antagonists, drugs that target this pathway, put into clinical trials. And these are still ongoing. There's nothing proven yet, but they're very promising, and probably the most exciting data we have to date comes from attacking the complement system. And it's also bolstered our hopes based on the fact that we know that the genetics are telling us the system is involved. And so we can actually monitor patients to look at those who might be at most risk based on genetic makeup, and then perhaps use those patients in clinical trials because they may receive the best benefits. Finally, we want to talk a little bit about some of the regenerative medicine treatments going forward, and you'll hear a little bit more about that as we talk, and you've heard about it already. Stem cells. Everybody's talking about stem cells and the promise of stem cells. So in this particular indication we're talking about for geographic atrophy, you want to be able to nurture or replace and repair either the photoreceptors, the neurons that actually do all this change of taking light and producing chemical signals, or the retinal pigment epithelium with stem cells. And so stem cells can come from many different sources. There are many widely are being investigated. This can come from umbilical cord blood. They can come from embryonic stem cells, or they can come from tissue-derived stem cells. Adipose tissue is being used to derive stem cells. So you can take your own fat and get your own stem cells from it, and then put them in the eye and hope for a better outcome. And so these are all being investigated in a variety of clinical trials. And so the promise of stem cell research is being investigated very hotly, not only worldwide, but very intensely going on within the Institute and Moorfields, as you know. What we think is another way to think about regenerative medicine as we go forward is going beyond stem cells. And this is very early days, but I'd like to tell you a little bit about it, which is We know we can isolate stem cells from various tissues, and there are stem cell-like cells within the retina already, progenitor cells, cells that are waiting to be told, change the way that you look and turn into a neuron, turn into a photoreceptor. But the chemical signals aren't there to tell them to do this. And so many pharmaceutical companies are working with academics who have great tools in terms of looking at these progenitor cells and trying to encourage them with drugs to actually change from one cell type into something that would be beneficial and repair the damaged retina. And so many drug screens are being conducted across the world to look if you can actually begin to either inject a drug or take a pill that influences the cells that already exist to turn into cells that would be most useful to repair the damage that you have in the particular tissue, and in this case in the retina and RPE going forward. So there's a great potential. Much is ongoing, and I'm sure over the next 2 to 3 years, that will double the number of clinical trials that are ongoing for late-stage AMD. Ultimately, as you heard, we want to go to earlier stages. We want to treat at that intermediate to early stage of AMD and prevent the damage. We don't want to figure out how to repair the damage. We don't want to slow the damage. We want to stop it. We don't want it to happen. And in order for that to happen, there needs to be a lot of clinical research and basic research done in order to investigate what we can measure in patients who have this earlier stage of disease that is convincingly telling us that if we can stop some of these functional changes, that we can actually stop that damage in the late term, and so prevent it from ever happening at all. And so with the help of genetics, as I've said, to help identify patients who might be at most risk, and better clinical tools and assessments in the clinic, the next big revolution, we hope, is going to be preventing geographic atrophy in this really advanced form of the disease. And thank you for your attention coming.
I'd like to ask about the anti-inflammatories. Is there any way one can get them from your doctor or ophthalmologist?
For the treatment of geographic atrophy?
Take aspirin or something?
Yeah. Yeah. For the treatment of geographic atrophy, right now, these are all investigational treatments. They're not really available. They're being tested in clinical trials going forward. So hopefully, with positive outcomes coming from clinical trials, they'll be available. As I said, some of them are already registered drugs that are being applied for different purposes now. So instead of for reducing the reaction to foreign organs in transplant, it's actually now trying to slow the progression of atrophy. But they will become available once they're proven in randomized controlled trials in the future. So hopefully in the next years they'll be available.
May I ask one more thing?
Yes.
I read somewhere that taking aspirin might increase the risk of dry becoming wet. Is that known yet? Or?
Yeah. So that's quite a complex answer. In fact, that paper was written by one of our ex-fellows who's gone back to Australia. And it was based, so one of these things, I'm going to take a step back. Quite often we pick up the newspaper and say that ingesting nuts causes this disease, or next year they'll say the complete opposite. And that's because these studies are based on what are called epidemiology studies, where we look at lots of patients in the community and see what they have, what disease they have, and have questionnaires or look at their past medical history and see whether or not they had aspirin. The trouble is, people who have aspirin regularly also have heart disease, and the risk factors of heart disease are shared for the risk factors for AMD. So in these population studies, all you can do is generate a hypothesis, but not prove that that cause is causative. So aspirin, you can't say it's definitely causative. You can say there seems to be an association. And then what you should do afterwards is do what's called a randomized trial and follow those patients up for years. Now, that's not going to happen because it's already partially happened. There was a study in the States called the Physicians' Health Study where physicians, huge numbers of physicians, were randomized many, many years ago to have aspirin or no aspirin. And in long-term follow-up, there was no increase in patients on aspirin to get AMD. So if you put all the evidence together, there is an association of taking aspirin with AMD, but it's probably confounded because you're more likely to have heart disease if you take aspirin. But in the only long-term follow-up trial, in a randomized trial, it does not increase risk. So I do not advise patients whose physicians have been given aspirin to reduce heart disease or strokes to stop it. It's a complex answer.
Have a question over here.
I would like to ask, the early stage dry AMD, does it always progress into the later stage AMD? And if it does, how long does it take? Because I've got sort of early stage AMD, and I'm quite young. I'm only in my 50s, and you were all saying that you would be in your 60s or 70s. And I just wonder if it's absolutely inevitable that it's going to turn into the later stage dry AMD.
Sure. I'm not sure I have the statistics right. I think if you're talking about dry AMD progressing to advanced dry AMD, it's something around 15 to 25% of patients. Is that right, Adnan? That would progress to geographic atrophy?
So it's that sort of ballpark, and the current concept is if we all live to 130, you'd all get it, and it's probably genetic and environment as to when you actually develop the atrophy. So we can say that on average about a third of patients in their lifetime will develop it, and the prevalence is higher as you get older. So when you're 90, 20% of the general population will have AMD, and a small proportion will have late dry. So it will. If we all live long enough and have early AMD in our 50s, you will eventually develop it, but we do not know when.
Oh, so it varies. I mean, it seems to run in our family. I've always expected to get it, and sure enough, I got it.
You may not get the late atrophic form in your lifetime, but we can't say for an individual patient whether that's true. All we can say that on average a third would develop it. You still have the risk of developing wet, which, if you have bilateral dry, is approximately a 1 in 4 risk in the next 5 years.
And if you've just got the drusen and they're getting worse and worse year after year, does that block your central vision as well?
So the drusen themselves have a modest effect on the visual function. It really only causes a significant problem.
I didn't understand that.
Oh, sorry. So the little waste build-up...
No, I mean, I didn't understand it before, but I thought that it was the actual drusen that blocked your sight, but it's not.
No, well, the drusen themselves, you can actually have huge amounts of drusen and still be in the legal driving standard. So it does have a modest effect on vision. It usually affects your ability to go from light to dark. Some patients wake up with a dark patch in the centre. Their ability to read in low contrast is affected, but they can still see the number plate in the 20 metres in the legal driving standard. So there are subtle defects in vision. It's only when the waste builds up to a level that the waste disposal cells, the pigment cells, start dying in the atrophic form that you start getting more severe visual dysfunction. It's a slow process over years unless you have the second hit of wet AMD.
Oh, right. Oh, thank you very much. Thank you.
And there's a question over in the middle here. Thank you.
Yes, optometrists are now doing retinal scanning. Is this any help in identifying very early dry AMD?
Optometrists are becoming more and more involved in management of eye disease, retinal disease. There are potentially a number of advantages in terms of identifying disease early. One of the challenges is that, as we've been hearing, at the moment we have relatively little that we can actually do to offer people with that condition. So one of the dilemmas about that kind of early screening is identifying a problem for which we actually can't solve at the moment. It may be that by identifying people in an early stage of the condition, then we can get a better understanding of how it affects the population, and that can give us valuable information about who might be at risk of sight loss from the condition. But I think we have to be a bit careful about suggesting that by identifying disease early, we can actually offer any help at the moment.
So that puts optometrists in a bit of a dilemma as to what to say to their people they're scanning?
I think it does present something of a dilemma, absolutely, yeah.
Although if you have, so the OCT screening, which is the scans that most optometrists have, can pick up the wet form as well. And as I mentioned, one of the most important things is that even our current treatments are highly effective, and they're even more effective if we start the treatment early. So it still has a role. Now, if you just have the bilateral dry, what it is useful in a patient who's never heard of it or read about it is to then have education about what symptoms to look out for so they can self-monitor and represent promptly, and so we can initiate. So I still think it does have a role. And I think it'll have an increasing role. And there is some general advice like stopping smoking that we would give as well.
Thank you, Adam.
You say you want to catch people early. Will you be promoting it to the general public in layman's terms? Because I'd never heard of it till it hit me in the eye.
Yes, I think this goes back to the discussion that we just had, which is, without the availability of treatments right now, there hasn't been the general screening ongoing for the wider population to look for the earlier disease. It is caught in certain circumstances by opticians doing scans or by general checkups within the clinics. I think this is now changing, as I tried to allude to. And as I've discussed with Adnan just earlier, we're beginning to run clinical trials just to begin to observe patients with earlier disease in large numbers of patients, so we understand the progression of it, how quickly it changes, but also understand how visual function changes and the morphology of what's going on in the back of the eye changes. And with that increasing interest in developing drugs to treat these the dry form of disease, I think you'll begin to see more education spreading out, so that people are actually going earlier on to go see their optician or their ophthalmologist so that they can be monitored for disease. So increasingly, I think we'll be going towards the earlier stages, but also educating around the earlier stages of disease and what it's about.
Can I say something regarding that? I got diagnosed at the age of 21 with dry macular degeneration, and I've been going to Moorfield since then. I've only just in the last 6 months found out that I'm not going to go fully blind because, well, supposedly, not yet. I've only just found that out by a rehabilitation officer in Birmingham City Council. I only just found out today, when you said it earlier, that there are 2 stages of macular degeneration. I was completely unaware of that, and I've been going to Moorfields for 4 or 5 years. They've talked to me a lot about a lot of large phrases that I have no idea what it means. I say I have no idea, but I'm getting slightly anxious now talking about it. We need these things in really simple terms. We aren't ophthalmologists. We don't understand these things straight off the map. We need it said to us in a format that we understand. And I mean, that's somebody who's been going to Moorfields for 5 years now. And that's really shocking. I mean, it's one thing to start, but we need to know what we've got and how it's going to affect us. And I'm also really interested, you've been talking about these tests that people are going for, that they'll be going through the experiments, that you'll be testing them out. And I'd like to know what kind of psychological support they get, whether they have to go through a particular test, whether you check that they're psychologically ready to go through that. Because it's stressful enough if you've had your sight for most of your life and then suddenly it starts going. How do you check that people are ready for this? And what kind of counselling or support is available while they're going through these tests? Because I can imagine that the first few years is going to be a pretty scary time. And I'm really interested to find out what emotional support there is.
So I think those are absolutely fantastic questions. And the reason we're having a meeting like this today, and we didn't have a meeting like this 10 years ago, is that we've realised we need to change the way we interact with the patients with the disease, because we have, as a community, been guilty of being distant in our research and in our explanations. So, as David mentioned, we're planning a very large study to try and monitor early disease, but as part of the planning of the trial, there is going to be an active patient group with patients with the disease and patient support groups helping the design of the trial. When we do a test, before we integrate that into a larger trial, we will get patient feedback on what it's like to undergo that test and help design the patient information sheets and the patient communication. So you've really highlighted one of the key reasons why we need a meeting like today, is that there has been a gap on our part in communication and involvement in developing together better treatments. Thank you.
I reiterate Adnan's comments that this is exactly the sort of, these are exactly the sort of issues that we're very keen to hear and to address. And in just a couple of moments, I'll go on to describe how, as people directly affected by the condition, you can get more involved in how we communicate and how we conduct the research that we are keen to do.